Okay, hello. What I'm going to talk about on this video is truly a fascinating topic. As the board says, research terminology relevant to clinical evaluation. Those of you who have had a research class in the past, if these terms look very familiar to you, if you pop up the list of terms on D2L and they all look completely like you could say them in your sleep, you're free to take this DVD and sell it on the street and become a millionaire. If, however, research terms are something that went into your brain for long enough to hopefully pass the test and then fell promptly out of your brain, please read the list which is attached on D2L. I'm going to go over them with probably some examples similar to what's on the handout as well as some other ones, just to give everybody kind of a good understanding of what the terms mean. The purpose of this is that I will use these terms throughout the quarter, and if you know what it is that I'm saying, then the context will make sense. If you don't know what it is I'm talking about, it'll be much harder to follow the rest of what the rest of what I'm saying. So, to begin with some of the students' most favorite research ideas, test validity and test reliability. First and foremost, note the word test in front of each of these. We will talk later in the quarter about internal and external validity related to a study. And so there's the validity of a study, there is the validity of a specific test. So these two that we're going to discuss right now have to do with a test. And given that as clinical social workers, the tests you'll be most commonly giving are some sort of personality measure test. So this would be a test of depression, a test for anxiety, a test for stress or for parenting skills or something like that. And what are these and why do they matter? If any of you have taken a course in psychometrics or test and measurement through a psychology department, you spend an entire quarter or semester going over what is a good test and what is a bad test. When we talk in here about developing your own research tool and choosing something like a Beck Depression Inventory, an outcome questionnaire, a Burns Depression Inventory, or something like that, how do you choose what is a good test and what is a poor test? And so we will talk some more specifically then. But right now, two of the things you want to look for in choosing a test is that it has some fairly good reliability and it has some fairly good validity. So what in the world are these two terms? Test validity is most commonly described as the test measures what it says it measures. So if I say I'm measuring self-esteem, I'm actually measuring self-esteem and not depression and not how happy you're feeling today and not how tense you are, but actually self-esteem. What is self-esteem? We will get to that little problem shortly. So does the test measure what it says it's measuring? And then the question is, and how do you know? Reliability of a test is, does the test measure something in a consistent fashion? So that if the construct or variable that we're measuring stays the same, a reliable test will yield the same score every time. Now think about physical instruments that you would use. If you drive in your car and your car says you're going 65 miles an hour, you expect that 65 miles an hour on your speedometer today, 65 in your speedometer tomorrow, and 65 in your speedometer next week and last month, you're doing the same speed every single time. And if one day you were doing 65 and you were zipping by everybody on the highway, and the next day you're doing 65 and everyone was zipping by you, you might kind of wonder. If you came from Tri-Cities to Walla Walla and you cruised at 65 miles an hour and one day it took you 59 minutes to get here, and the next day your speedometer said you were cruising at 65 and it took you 3 hours to get here, you might start worrying about that speedometer. Am I really going the same speed? So reliability is the ability of an instrument to measure something consistently, assuming that that something is consistent. If I want to know how much I weigh, I step on a scale. It gives me a weight. It says you weigh, I don't know, 115 pounds. I step off the scale. I think, I'd really rather weigh a little bit more than 115 pounds. I wonder if I step on the scale if I'd weigh more. I step back on and it says 112 pounds. I say, well, geez, how did I lose weight just standing there and thinking? I get off. I get back on and it says 182 pounds. And I say, how did I gain all this weight? I haven't done anything but stepped back and stepped on. That's an unreliable measure. And we expect, if we have a bathroom scale, and some of us know, well, I think I don't really want to weigh 115. I'd rather weigh 112. If I just stand here exactly like this on the back part and think very light thoughts, maybe meditate and try levitating, maybe I won't weigh as much. But ideally, a good scale, an expensive scale, if you weigh 115, you weigh 115, you weigh 115. If you're doing 65 on the highway, it says 65 every time you're going just as quickly. What we measure in clinical social work are much more ephemeral, fuzzy, nebulous concepts. So we don't measure how fast someone's going on a highway. We measure how racing their thoughts are in a manic episode. We give them a test, a paper and pencil, true, false, or 1 to 5 kind of inventory. We give them a Beck depression inventory to come up with a depression score. We give them a Hamilton depression inventory. We give them an outcome questionnaire. Most of our tests are a variety of different questions that people answer usually on a strongly agree to strongly disagree, sometimes, never, rarely, sometimes, often, always, and then we add up the points. A reliable test of self-esteem says that if you have really good self-esteem, assuming that that's a reasonably stable concept, your score today will be the same as next week, will be the same as next month. An IQ test, generally speaking, by the time we're adults, the belief is that barring something like, a serious head injury or serious disease, our IQ stays fairly stable. If you get an IQ score of 140 one day and 172 the next day, you start questioning the test rather than, what did I eat for breakfast and let me do it again? It made me so much smarter. So a reliable test is one that measures something consistently. Most tests in our field, if I took it now, I closed my eyes, twirled around in a circle, and took it again, or I walked downstairs, came back, and I took it again, I would probably not score exactly the same. And the reason for this is we have a lot of questions that say something like, I feel fresh and rested most mornings. And we read it, and if we woke up fresh and rested that morning, we say true. If that night we tossed and turned and were stressed, we wake up, I feel fresh. Oh, this morning I feel terrible, and we say false. It's the same question, but our referent of most mornings, if I feel fresh and rested today, I might think that's how I usually feel. If I feel really groggy and sleepy today, that's the most recent recollection, and I may answer that question differently. So the item is unstable. Unreliability in tests is due to flipping a coin 49-51 one way, due to questions that don't really make sense to us, and so we just guess on them, due to sort of poorly worded questions and all sorts of things. But most of our tests are only reliable somewhere between like 0.80 and about 0.95, which doesn't exactly mean, but you could sort of take to mean about 80% of the time you take the test, you'll score about the same way the next time. It's a correlation between the two items. Or if I correlated scores on the first time and the next time, they'd come up about a correlation of about 95%. The same. But some tests have a reliability of somewhere around a 50, which means if you just want to really roughly think about it, at least half of the way that someone answered that test is totally up for grabs the next time they take it. And technically, it's actually more. This is just a rough estimate of how you'd make out those numbers. So when you're choosing a test, you want a test which actually measures what it says it's measuring. And you also want a test which is reliable, that measures something stably, so that if I get on the scale and I really do weigh 115, it says that every time I get on, unless I'm carrying a brick or something like that, and hence it would weigh more. With validity, how do we know that my self-esteem test is really measuring self-esteem? What in the world is self-esteem? If I ask myself and I write down an essay, I'll come up with my thought of self-esteem. If everybody taking this class was to write an essay and D2L it in on the discussion board, if 20 students are taking this class, we might have 20 different descriptions of self-esteem. Well, how do we know a test measures something when 20 people can't even agree on what the something is? So that's a real problem for validity in our field. What we do is we have some sort of idea. I think I know what depression is. So then we develop a test, and people with high scores should be more depressed. So I develop a test, I give it to 100 people. People with really high scores should seem more depressed, which means if you look at their behavior, they should be more sad, they should be more melancholy, they should have more troubles concentrating, they should have lower energy, they should have, poor appetite and poor sleeping. People with scores that say you're not very depressed should have far fewer of those problems. And that's sort of how we test the validity. If you read your texts, they'll talk about a whole bunch of different forms of validity: content, construct, convergent, face, and on and on. They'll talk about different kinds of reliability. Test, retest is what we've been talking about. There's a thing called internal consistency. There's a thing called the alpha coefficient. There's a split half. They're all getting at this idea of, does the test measure something consistently, and does it measure what it says it's measuring? If I give you guys a multiple choice test at the end of this class, if it has split half reliability, we could take the first half of the test and the second half of the test, and you should, if you get a 90%, you should get 90% on the first half and 90% on the second half. If it's a valid measure of what you've learned in this class, those of you who come out of this class really knowledgeable should score well, and those of you who come out of the class clueless should score poorly. That would be validity. Reliability would be if your knowledge on the top half is similar to the knowledge on the bottom half, that's split half. If your knowledge today is similar to if the knowledge you have when you leave class is similar to 2 weeks later, that's got some test-retest reliability. They're hard concepts, but we will use them over and over through the quarter. All the other definitions up here are generally pretty much more straightforward. Cross-sectional versus longitudinal research. Cross-sectional research tends to be slice in time research. There's a more sophisticated definition of that, but the quick and dirty term that we will use is you go into a group of people, you administer them some sort of test or put them through some sort of paradigm or something like that. One slice in life, one point in time. Many of you probably for your research projects that you did undergraduate or first year graduate school did cross-sectional kinds of studies. Longitudinal research is research that is done over the course of time. Generally speaking, and again, the technicalities get more detailed, but generally speaking, when we talk about longitudinal research, we're discussing studying the same person at multiple points in his or her life. In this class, most of you will be doing longitudinal research. The idea or paradigm of this class: did the client I was working with change as a result of our intervention? Client comes in, you measure them. You develop some sort of clinical intervention. You implement your intervention and you measure them maybe at a midpoint. You measure them maybe when they're finished with treatment, and perhaps you call them and invite them to come back 6 months later. That's a longitudinal study, at least 2 different points in time where you're measuring the client. And ideally, what we're looking at in longitudinal research is how do things change over time. This also allows us better to see causality. If I want to know, did my clinical social work intervention help the client to get better? If I just measure a client who's finished with, let's say, counseling, and I give them a depression test and they score medium, well, I know that at the end of therapy, this person scores in the sort of medium range of a depression test. What does that tell me about how helpful the therapy was? Pretty much tells me nothing. But if I had a test from when she started therapy, and now I have another test and she started therapy and her depression score was up here, and now she's finished with therapy and it's come down to this midpoint, then I say therapy was helpful. However, if she started therapy and she was very undepressed and now she's at that same point, I say, ooh, wow, she's more depressed now after having gone to therapy than she was prior to coming. So it helps you see sort of what happens first and what happens later. It's very hard to have one point in time and know if your intervention is effective. Subjective and objective measures. If we think about academics, subjective measures are things like essay tests, things like papers. The subjectivity, generally speaking, is seen in the scoring or in the grading. If I have a class and everybody takes a multiple choice test, you could do it on a Scantron sheet, we could stick them all through the computer, we could score them by hand, I could score them, my teaching assistant could score them, and it should be that you get exactly the same score no matter how the test is scored, because an A on a multiple choice test is an A is an A, and a C is a C is a C, and if you circle A or you circle C, who's ever grading it should score it the same way. The objective test. The scoring is objective. A subjective test, the scoring is subjective. It's up to the interpretation of the person who is doing the scoring. You turn an essay test into me, the teacher. I read it and I say, this isn't what I was looking for at all. And so I give you a bad grade. Now let's say you get it back and you say, I think this was a great test. I think I did beautifully. You come to me and talk about it. I say, I think you did terribly. You say, oh, I want to contest my grade. Can I go show it to another teacher? I say, sure. You go show it to another teacher. The other teacher says, Heather, where was your brain? This is a beautiful test. Well, the reason that I thought it was terrible and the other teacher thought it was wonderful, we may have different expectations, different ways of interpreting your data, your answer. And the subjectivity is that what impresses me favorably may not impress someone else favorably. What impresses them may not impress me. What you think is important and what I think is important may not be the same. Now, what teachers try to do, and I know that in a lot of classes here you have grading rubrics try to take a subjective thing like an essay or a paper and turn it into something more objective by saying, here are the criteria that we're grading on, and here's how many points you get, and here's what you do to get full credit. So that's trying to objectify something which is more by nature subjective. But subjective is open to interpretation of scoring, and objective is multiple choice tests, true-false tests, where the answer is what the answer is what the answer is. Qualitative and quantitative data. Quantitative data is data which comes in number form, and many of the psychological tools that we use yield some sort of score. So an IQ test tells how smart we are in terms of numbers that range roughly from a 50 to 150. A Beck depression test ranges from a 0, no depression, to a 63, exceedingly depressed. There are, child behavior checklist is a score on sort of how troubled is the behavior of this particular kid. An outcome questionnaire measures on scores on 45 different items, kind of how the person is doing in a variety of different aspects of life. The SCL-90 is a symptom checklist with 90 different things. It yields a score of how many symptoms found in the DSM that a person may be experiencing. They yield numbers. Numbers are nice because we can stack them up. I can do a Beck depression inventory on everybody, and I can organize a class from the least depressed to the most depressed student. I can pigeonhole those scores into norms. These are the people who are not depressed. These are the people with mild. These are the people with moderate. These are the people with high levels of depression. So numeric data, and then you can sort of quantify it by organizing people, by putting people into sort of different groups and saying this score means this. Qualitative data is data more in terms of words or in terms of pictures. And so if you have people do projective drawing tests, draw a person test, a house tree person test, something like that is qualitative. Doing an oral interview with somebody, doing a focus group, you have a lot of words. And then what do you do with your lot of words once you get them? How do you make sense of them? Qualitative data tends to be very rich. If I'm curious as to how depressed someone is, if I give them a Beck, I have one number, 49. That tells me how depressed you are, 49. I could engage in a 1-hour interview with somebody and say, Tell me about your life. How's your mood? And ask a bunch of questions pertinent to their level of depression. The Beck will yield me a way of saying your depression is in this range, and here's how you compare with everybody else. The qualitative interview will give me a beautiful, lovely picture of the individual. But if I need to organize a group of 20 people from most to least depressed, and I have 20 interviews mulling around in my head, that's a much more labor-intensive and difficult process than if I just have the numbers and can peg them on down. There is a bias in our field to think quantitative is somehow more real or more true. That is slowly changing. People sort of in power, people with money, people who write us grants and so forth. And I think for years, psychologists who tried to pattern themselves after physicists as scientists thought that if we could just turn humans into numbers, we could understand and we could get the scientific respect or the respect of the scientific community. So there are formulas and there are tests and they yield scores. And there's probably some value in that. But you gain a lot talking to somebody. Tell me about your experience. That you don't gain from giving somebody a bunch of numeric tests. Many students will say when they take a multiple choice test, but it doesn't really measure what I learned in this class. This score doesn't reflect what I got out of this class. Because it's my choice as a teacher to ask you these 20 questions with these possible options. If I ask you an essay test, you have a little more opportunity to express what it is that you feel like you've learned. So that's the quantitative, qualitative, and qualitative data tends to be scored or interpreted much more subjectively. Quantitative data tends to be more objective. Prospective and retrospective studies. If we have a timeline, and this is today, a prospective study, I formulate my question today. I start gathering my subjects today or in the future. It starts today with the question and the idea, and it moves out towards the future. Retrospective starts today, but it looks back into the past. In science, prospective studies are seen as more credible than our retrospective studies. Why is that? If I have a bunch of people who I'm asking the effects of a certain thing, how effective is counseling? And so I get a bunch of people in a room and I say, how many of you have been to see a counselor? And it's a group of people who either has a silent ballot or they're willing to share this information. And so somehow I find out, for my group of 20 people, this 15 have been to counseling. And so then I do interviews with everybody and I say, well, tell me how counseling affected you. How did it affect your symptoms? How did it affect your interpersonal relations? And people sort of remember back, well, you know, I think I was 12 years old when I went to counseling, or well, I was just finished counseling about 6 months ago, and this is what I remember. So people are starting today and they're remembering back. A prospective study would be, we now have a group of 20 people who are going to counseling. We start today and we measure them on a bunch of tools, and we go into the future and we see if and how they change. In the couples class I teach, there are studies on the effect of divorce on children. A prospective study is we find a bunch of kids whose parents are divorcing now, and we study them into the future and see how they grow and develop and form connections and relationships and so forth. A retrospective study is I go into a business, or I stand out in front of Walmart, or I go to a college class, and I say, how many of you, I hand out a survey, and one of my questions is, did your parents divorce while you were growing up? Of those who say yes, I look back and I say, well, how did this affect you? A problem with looking back is that what happens is when we think back, our impressions of the past are very much colored by what's going on currently. If I'm in a good, happy mood and feeling good about things, I tend to remember things more favorably. If I'm in a grumpy mood, I tend to remember things more disfavorably. So if you ask me about my relationship with my husband, and we just had a wonderful weekend together, and I left him in the morning with a big kiss and a bouquet of roses, and you say, tell me about, the two of you's relationship over the last 20 years. Oh, it's been wonderful, so loving and so forth. Because how I'm feeling right now is warm and fuzzy. Catch me 3 weeks from now when we fought like, cats and dogs all weekend, and I stormed out of the house and he slammed the door in my face and says, I don't care if I ever see you again. You ask me, how's my relationship with my husband? It's the same husband, it's the same relationship, but we just had a big, terrible fight. He's the biggest jerk of the century. Our relationship has not changed. It's simply the lens through which I'm viewing it right now. The problem of retrospective research is it has the lens of where I am now, in what developmental stage, in what mood, with what selective memories do I pick and choose from. Prospective research hopefully tries to overcome some of that. Now, one thing you can do that makes retrospective studies a bit better is if you have records. So if you want to study something like absenteeism in school, schools generally keep pretty good records about kids who are tardy and kids who are absent. So you could look at the effects of absenteeism on school grades or school performance or something like that, and you could go to the office and you could get the records. If you're interested in academic performance, pretty much every school keeps a very good record of a kid's report cards or a college student or grad student's transcripts. So you could get records that would go back. If you're interested in health history, you could get records that go back. So documents are seen as being less influenced by the idea of selective attention, selective memory, whereas just asking people's memory is seen as somewhat suspect in terms of scientificness. Reactivity has to do with, as a participant in research, by virtue of being studied, you change. So that if you know somebody is watching you, do you act as naturally as you would if you didn't know someone was watching you? And the more you change, the more reactive you are. Some types of research are highly reactive. Other types of research are far less highly reactive. When we talk about self-monitoring, when you do your self-monitoring, if you monitor your eating, if you monitor your cussing, if you monitor critical comments, whatever it is you're monitoring, you're going to be hyper aware of. And so if you're monitoring how much junk food you eat, oftentimes people find they don't eat as much junk food because A, wow, I really do eat a lot of junk food. B, I have to write it down. And C, I have to turn it into my teacher. I don't want her to see how much junk food I eat. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why self-monitoring leads people often to change the behavior that they're doing. So as you're working with clients, as you're sort of gathering information, think about, as I'm having them monitor or take this test, does the testing in and of itself lead them to change their responses, and if so, how? And this is above and beyond people consciously choosing to lie, as people will certainly consciously choose to do. Sometimes people will lie to look better, sometimes people will lie to look worse. But reactivity is simply the kid riding a bicycle who says, look, Mom, I can ride. And as soon as Mom turns, whoosh, the kid falls right off the bicycle. It's the person who can do things just fine until they know that somebody's watching, and then all of a sudden they freeze up. So that's reactivity. Last two terms here, operational definitions. A concept, if you look for something in a dictionary, you look up a term, you'll get what's called a conceptual definition. A conceptual definition, it tries to be rich and complete. It describes the term so that somebody could really fully appreciate and understand the meaning of the concept. An operational definition is a definition which is limited in a circumscribed fashion so that people can agree on it at a high level. So if I try to define stress conceptually, I want a full, rich picture of what is stress. If I want to define stress for research, I want that when I'm talking about stress, and the next person's talking about stress, and the next person's talking about stress, we're all talking about the same thing. Hence, something like score on the state trait anxiety inventory trait part is my operational definition of stress. Now, is it as rich as what you'll find in Webster's or American Heritage? Maybe not. Score on a test may not be very rich, but 25 people can look at a score on the state trait part of the test and agree this client scored, whatever their score was. If it's depression, a rich conceptual definition of depression tries to capture the whole thing. An operational definition of depression could be client has cried at least 15 minutes in the last 24 hours. It's a very, very limited definition, but it's pretty easy. You ask someone, have you cried for 15 minutes within the last 24 hours? I could define good student. Good student is somebody who comes to class on time, takes notes in class, and stays until class is over. By that definition, nobody watching this tape is probably a good student in this class because there is no class. However, it's very easy to see if I'm a teacher and I want to rate who's a good student. People who move through the door and are seated at the time the class starts, pull out a notebook and take notes, and stay until the very end. That's my definition of good student, and it's very easy for people to see and agree on. So a definition in turn with a high level of agreement, often based upon observable behavior. I want to measure fidgetiness. Well, how fidgety does a person need to be? So is it, how much wiggling does one need to do in a certain amount of time? What is an operational definition if a teacher is saying these kids are too fidgety? Well, what is too fidgety? How do we define? How many movements per minute? How big are the movements? How bothersome are the movements? How do we define those terms? Last term to go over, triangulation. This has to do with the idea. This has to do with if we're looking to measure something, not just gathering data from one source, but gathering information from a multitude of different sources. And the purpose for this is because much of what we measure is kind of fuzzy. It often is somewhat subjective. And hence, how do we know what true is or what is valid? So the most common place that I, as a clinician, have seen people truly triangulate in terms of coming up with a description or diagnosis is if you have a child and the question is, does this kid have ADHD? Oftentimes, that question, and ideally that question is not simply answered by a teacher saying, oh, this kid drives me crazy, put him on Ritalin. You talk with the teacher, you talk with last year's teacher, you talk with mom, you talk with dad, you observe the child in maybe 2 or 3 different settings. You give a child behavior checklist to mom, to dad, to the teacher. You may do some testing with the kid. But it's a variety of different sources of information so that if it's just one teacher says, oh, this kid cannot pay attention, and every other teacher that child has ever had says, excuse me, that child is very, very attentive, I don't see any trouble, then maybe it's not the child, maybe it's the teacher's perception of the child. If you have parents who are very calm, sedate parents, and they have a kid who's really kind of bubbly and active and perhaps fidgety, they may say, oh, this kid needs Ritalin, my goodness, he or she's so ADHD. But you talk to the teacher, and the teacher says, no, that's just what, a 5-year-old boy is like. So you want to get information from a variety of different sources. If you think about it, think about the epicenter of an earthquake, and you need to get at least 3 pieces of information to say this is where the earthquake is centered. There's nothing magical about 3 in our field. It can be 3 sources of data, it can be 12 sources of data, but you want to have multiple sources of information rather than just relying on any one source of information before sort of making a statement or a diagnosis or important decisions about someone's life. Anyway, that is the end of this lovely conversation about definitions, and probably when you watch this should be tape number 2 in order.